Hey guys, I thought I'd share another little something from the studio. This is a study I've did in the last couple of weeks here, and it was inspired by a classical painting, and I wanted to kind of come back to consciously being aware of really simple elements of art like shape and composition and color and line and all these things. And I also wanted to explore, painting on a non-white background, which I've done in the past, but, with dark backgrounds or what have you, but working with a gold acrylic and some clear gesso over that on the page was a lot of fun. And then I also wanted to play with some paints that I fell in love with a couple of years ago that I just haven't had the chance to really explore like I've wanted to, and that's gouache paints. And so I pulled those out. And it's just a cheap set that I had. I was waiting on a nicer set to come in the mail, but I got a little impatient and wanted to start this study while I was waiting. And then I'm working with the Neocolor water-soluble wax, crayons there, to draw out the composition of this sketch based on a little marker and paper sketch that I had done that you see in the upper right corner. And then once I had kind of sketched out and blocked off some areas, really focusing more on shape than on realism, and flipping the page at one point so that I didn't get too caught up in the figural element. Then I started to block in some first layers of color, being full aware that I may very well cover those up entirely. Now the fun thing about gouache, I don't know if you've never worked with them, is they're like somewhere between acrylic and watercolor, but much like watercolor, they re-wet and you can pick up the color again. So if you mess something up and you want to wipe it away, that's a possibility. Or the color you put over top of another color can be blended with the color beneath it. And they have this really beautiful opacity to them, a little bit chalky feeling. They dry really fast, so not everybody likes them. But I don't know, they've just been really appealing to me. For a lot of different reasons. They feel like an in-between between acrylic and watercolor, and I love the ability to work and kind of rework in these layers, and then this gorgeous matte quality that you get from them. It's a little bit like egg tempera paints and like old icon paintings. And that's a piece of my inspiration here too. I've been looking at some old icon and illuminated manuscript type art in the last few years, and that quality just kind of is on my mind. And actually I think gouache was used in a lot of illuminated manuscripts in the past. And so just playing with those ideas and bringing them together for this study was a lot of fun. As I was blocking in the color, what I'm thinking about a lot of the time is just balance, really. How is the color dispersed around the page? And I'm noticing as I make marks how it changes things, and then I start to give some consideration to, where is the composition leading the eye? How's that working? So I got those two ovals for the faces there in the middle, and then I really loved those two yellow ovals that represented the limbs on one of the figures, and then this big sun-like orb in the background. Obviously those are the strongest points, but then I have all these little shapes around and they can create a different dynamic. Some of them will lead you into the page and some off. And so I was really kind of playing with how do you make that flow happen to where it's pulling you in towards this centralized story, that's happening, this little scene that might be happening. And then also, as I started to do that, portions of the piece that I was making began to kind of take shape into its own little world. My inspiration for the original sketch that I did was a classic painting by an Italian painter. It was an oil painting called Hagar and Ishmael in the Wilderness, and his name is Luigi something. It starts with a G. Gilarduzzi, Gilarduzzi. I'm not sure how to say it. I'm sure I slaughtered it. But anywho, my painting and sketch in that ends up being nothing like his painting. It was just inspired by the composition, his initial composition of the figures together in the central portion of his painting. And I liked that. And I just used that as kind of a launch pad to explore, my own little variation of those shapes in the way that he had them laid out. And then it became something totally different on my page. On that upper left corner, I just pulled away some of the colors that were there with a paper towel that was a little bit wet. And that's super easy to do with gouache, and it's a lot of fun. And then I could go in and try out a different color there and see what happens. when I was mixing the colors, I would use in a new color, if I introduced a new color like green or eventually purple, I would use a little bit of a previous color I had used in it to kind of tone down its brightness. So some of the yellow or some of the green would be mixed in to that red there, for instance, to kind of just tone it away from being such a bright red. And it helps create a kind of cohesion amongst, a composition or a painting through the color itself as well. There, I really liked those two yellow oval shapes in the front, so I thought I'd try out a third one, which I'll change. You'll see me do that. And then I reached a certain point here. The camera went off for a minute, but now I'm kind of placing some torn papers around, just with similar shades to what I might use, to kind of get an idea how the areas might change if I add in some black, if I add in some more blue tones, without actually making the marks on the page with the paint until I feel a little more ready to take that step, And so I use some different black ones, and then you'll see me come in and start filling in. After I outlined the collage papers, I'll start to fill in those areas with the color. And some of them, like right there, I needed to wipe away the underlayers first in order to change them without all the colors kind of blending together. As I moved along, some of my shapes became lines. Line is a shape, it's just a very thin shape. And then I started to block in some black here, and I remember thinking, I wondered if I had done it too soon on the piece, like maybe I hadn't figured out some of the areas enough yet. But I did, and there I was. Certainly I could have wiped some away if I needed to or wanted to, and seen what that did, but mostly I just kind of went with it in this piece, though I might have waited had I given it a little bit more thought at the time to block in some of those black areas. This piece was also partially inspired by a really great class by Carla O'Connor on using gouache, and she actually uses the gold background specifically in gouache, and I had remembered that when I was thinking about coming back to him and wanted to give it a try, and so that was kind of where the basis from that came from. So this piece is just like so inspired by all these little bits and pieces in my journey and story. Here now I'm doing the first attempt at adding some definition to the faces, and I wasn't looking at the reference at all, and I just totally botched it this first try. And so you'll see me flip to a totally blank slate on the faces here in just a moment because the video went off, and there they are. Basically, I just wiped away what I'd put in and then started fresh. And that second time around, I was more pleased with where it started to go and getting kind of the angle of the gaze and that on the lower figure's face was important because that head was like laying back, and I did want that to come through a little bit, even though I was abstracting these portraits. And then I went back to the Neocolor crayons to go over top, adding in some of these little pattern elements over top to add contrast, to add pattern, to add highlight here and there, and kind of move the piece more toward a more complete or harmonious state. I always feel at this point in the game that it's really the painting that's directing me. And I'm just trying to not get too heavy-handed or force my own will upon the painting, and instead respond. It really becomes that kind of call and responds with the piece. It's a relationship at this point, to try to work it to a place of feeling some closure or completeness. And a lot of that's just layering over different areas again and adding in textures. I saved those hands for last. And then little bits of detail, filling in little corners that weren't filled in, little nooks and crannies. That upper left corner I kept having trouble with and had to keep going back to, and what have you. And then here you have it. This was pretty close to the finished state. I did a few more things to finalize the piece after I turned the camera off, but this was pretty darn close, and I really enjoyed working with this medium and plan to do so more in the future. So I encourage you, how can you take little bits and pieces of things that are inspiring you and put them together into an art assignment? What new materials have you been wanting to try a little bit more? Have at it. Sometimes we just need to get back to the elements of art, something simple like a colored background to start with, or just change your medium for a piece or two and see if it inspires something new to happen in your practice or just sends you back home to the medium you really love.